And for more on the Chinese economy and its impact for the rest of the world, we are joined here in the Beijing studio by Professor Huo Deming from the National School of Development at Peking University. Professor Huo, welcome to our program.
Can't wait.
Good to see you. And also in New York, we have Max Wolf, Professor of Economics from New School University. Welcome, Professor. Meanwhile, in Brussels, we are joined by Daniel Gross, Director of the Center for European Policy Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. At the meeting, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang made very clear he suggested that China was not the problem, but rather still contributing greatly to the world's economic growth. Mr. Gross, what do you think of a statement like this? To what extent do you think China is still the pillar?
China is certainly still a pillar in the sense that growth of 7% is of course much more than any other country, and China's weight in the world economy is so large that 7% in China alone makes a good chunk for the world economy. But at the same time, the world knows that perhaps this cannot go on forever, that perhaps the wave of investment which we have seen in China will end sooner or later, and then the rest of the world might have problems, even though the problems in China itself might always remain manageable.
Is it possible, Professor Wolf, that we put all our hope for the world's economy on one or two economies and believing that will be the ultimate driving force for all of us, even if we don't work hard?
Yeah, so it's certainly not a good idea, nor would it lead to success, because the problem is if you have a situation, no matter how big, no matter how important a single country or a few countries are, where only a few countries are responsible for growth, you will have unbalanced migration, you will have huge trade imbalances, and you will have a very low participation rate in the global growth. So it's never a good idea, but I do think there's been a dependence in the world, and I think strangely and ironically, the world has counted on the United States to be the buyer of things in the world, and the Chinese to be the maker of things in the world, and the Chinese to be the contributor to global economic growth. So while it's not the Chinese fault, nor is it really a fair or reasonable expectation, you get a little bit of surprise from the global community if China slows, because there's a bit of a dependence on China, which wasn't so much acknowledged when the growth rates were higher, but is emerging somewhat painfully now that they're lower.
Right. There are some interesting phenomena, Professor Huo, that we have observed from the commentaries we've heard over the past few weeks and months about the Chinese economy. First of all, people they complain about China lack of, compared to before, commodity imports. But as we all know, according to the Chinese Premier, in fact, the volume has increased rather than decreased. It's only the price of commodity has been going down, and therefore, as a whole, it seems to be smaller than it used to be. But on the other hand, if China depends so much on commodity, that means China is doing so much only on investment and also real estate development. And that's a problem also. Okay, if people also talk about the RMB depreciation, and they say, if you depreciate RMB, there's going to be a currency war. But if China, the government, controls the RMB, then there's complaints that you are not doing anything to let the RMB become internationalized, to make it flexible, to let the market decide. So you seem to have complaints coming from both sides at their convenience. And yet, what is ultimately important, do you think, Professor Huo, for the health of the Chinese economy and therefore benefits as well for the others?
Okay. For the health
this
of
is
the
a very long
Chinese,
question, but I want to set the stage for you.
I'm not going to make it short, but let me start with your question. For the health of the Chinese economy as well as for the world. But we look at the growth for the world as a whole, starting from the 18th centuries. It was never a balanced growth. Well, after World War II, it's the U.S. that's the predominant growth factors. And then the Japan, the four tigers, so on and so forth. And remember that before the World War II, although the U.S. and the Europe, and especially before the 20th centuries, it was Europe was the predominant growth center. Right. So after the 21st century, all of a sudden, China becomes the predominant growth force for the whole world.
So your point is?
The point is, this is why whatever that China is doing is going to be the culprit or the model for the rest of the world, because the growth was never unbalanced. It's now the Chinese era. Well, I'm not saying that China is the most important, but just looking from the history, there's always one country that is always almost focused, take all the focus, the attention of the world.
Interesting observation. Mr. Gross, what do you think about this one flower blossom and therefore people think there's going to be a spring for everybody? Should we still use to these kind of phenomena when it comes to the real health of the economy?
No, I think the colleague in Beijing was quite right. The world has now focused on China as the growth engine and has forgotten to blame Europe, because Europe could, of course, also be and should be a growth engine, but the Europeans can't act together. It is just that the world has now gotten used to Europe not doing anything, that they have forgotten about our problems and the lack of our contribution. But I would still say that even though China is still growing healthily, there are concerns about the quality of the growth, and especially of the continuing reliance on investment. And I think that reliance cannot go on forever. We have heard for a long time about the rebalancing, but I haven't seen it yet. And I think that's the main concern for the future.
Before we go to the specific about China's problems, I will go to you, Professor Wolf. It seems that Mr. Gross has already taken up the spirit of criticism and also self-criticism, talking about the European situation. With that spirit, may I follow up with a question about the United States, the interest rates by Fed? There are so many questions related to that as to what would happen, when it's going to happen, and how it's going to influence our economy. And if it's not happening, what is going to be this uncertainty meaning for the rest of the world? What do you make of now the US economic strength, and even for one measure as the Fed's interest rates, and how is that likely to impact really the real structure and the health of the world economy for now, sir?
Sure. So I think it's a great question. I think the truth is that the Federal Reserve is one of the major shapers of global interest rate policy, and often does this with some, although perhaps muted, sense of global responsibility. That has been lost in part because of political pressure. So I think we're going to see the Federal Reserve make decisions, unfortunately, that are very reflective of and very focused on the domestic situation in the US. I also think, and I know this is a minority opinion, that they will not raise the rates this coming week. I think they'll keep them. I think they'll change the language to reflect that in the next and subsequent meetings, they will raise rates. That being said, we all know, it's just a question of when, that the era of basically costless money from the Federal Reserve is over. We also know that we have had 6 years of extraordinarily low interest rates and monetary stimulation, and that we have bought ourselves pretty mediocre growth. So we've seen a lot of speculative activity, but we have not seen great growth in the US. And furthermore, the trajectory of our growth is probably down. I think that there's a bit of a mistake in the US and the UK right now, where money is running to the US and UK as a safe harbor and out of habit, and that's being mistaken for more robust underlying macro fundamentals than actually exist.
Excessive savings that some consider as a big problem, and those savings are going to the American market as a result of investment. The investment only more in real estate than real economy. Mr. Gross, I want your comments before I go to Professor Huo here in Beijing. Mr. Gross.
Oh yes, China has really very high savings, which have been extremely important to stabilize Chinese growth, because during the very high growth rate, it was very important to have very high savings rates, so that China didn't need to import capital. But now China has a luxury problem. It has too much of a good thing, too many savings, and they can no longer be productively invested at home in China. So where do they go? They might go to the One Belt, One Road initiative, but there you cannot really spend a lot of money. So the fear abroad is that this flood of money might go into the foreign exchange market, might drive the currency down, and then we might again have very large trade surpluses of China. It hasn't happened yet, but if the savings in China remain so high, then I think this might come about, and then the rest of the world will be concerned.
All right. At this moment, Professor Huo, since we talk about China, others also do their own parts about their own economy. So let's talk about Chinese economy to you. What is this problem that we are still not yet reaching our goal of rebalancing on the one hand? On the other hand, the so-called transformation from investment-driven economy to more a consumption-driven economy, even though the Chinese premier argued very strongly the numbers that has been in a way contributed by consumption, but still people are saying we're not there yet. So how long will this process be? And what do you consider, Professor, given your inside information about what might be the most important areas now for us to act, while at the same time we can still take care of the GDP growth? Because it seems that we cannot afford not looking at the GDP.
Well, I don't have inside information, but I do have
But how about some
information.
insights? Okay, go ahead.
Look at the numbers. The GDP, the percentage of the percentage of GDP going to investment is about 48-47%, while it was 49%. Consumption share, private consumption share is about 36-37%. Altogether added up like 85%. Now, we're talking about balancing. I'm thinking of maybe for next 5 to 10 years, the consumption part is going to rise up to 45% of GDP, while investment coming down to 40%. So that will take about 5 to 10 years. My optimistic estimate is 5, but pessimistic is 10 years. So that will reach a stage what I would call balance. Although in terms of world standard, 40% of investment is still very high. Now, if you ask me whether there is a definitive ways of reaching that goal, I don't think there is a way. Simply put, while you are reducing the investment part of GDP, that will necessarily reduces the number, the jobs of employment of people. Now, when people have less employment, then they will have less income. When they have less income, they will have less consumption. So how can you balance with less investment but higher consumption at the same time within 10 years? That's my pessimistic estimate. So unbalancing is the word for China, and that's going to last for at least 5 and probably more than 5 to 10 years.
Professor Wolf, what do you think could be the remedy? I mean, do you believe that service jobs, for example, or service sector development, combined with China's exports of higher ends, would be able to solve the problem?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit on how you define the problem, right? I think that the Chinese economy can continue to grow robustly and above global averages and probably above 5.5% to 6%, which looks like the sort of minimum that is required for things to run smoothly. I think we can get to that point through cultivated innovation, through a larger consumption component of the domestic economy, and through a much more intensive focus on high value added production, both for domestic and international markets. The higher value added production allows you to do the inputs to production domestically in the lower value added, lower wage sectors, and then move those to the higher value added, higher wage sectors domestically, both for domestic and international consumption. But I do think that takes at least 5 to 10 years to re-articulate. It's a question of trajectory. As long as you're moving in that direction, you're on good footing.
Right. And Mr. Gross, your final words?
The direction outlined by my two colleagues is exactly the one China needs to go. More consumption, a little bit less investment. But I'm afraid it can be too slow. And if it's too slow, then China might find itself in a situation similar to that of Japan in the 1990s, with too much investment already done, and then the economy will stop growing. So I think faster adjustment now would be much better for the long-term growth prospect of the Chinese economy.
Every time I find when we talk about the economy these days, whether it's about China or elsewhere, it's always a very delicate balancing act. And that's the fascination of it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. It's a great input that you have helped. Daniel Gross, coming from Brussels, Max Wolf, New York, and also Huo Debing here in Beijing.